Hi everyone, I'm Miles. Thanks for clicking on the video. Before we get to that, I want to let you know that this video covers the Agatha Christie novel Hallowe'en Party. And after I'd started putting it together, they announced which Poirot story Kenneth Branagh is going to adapt next. Guess what? It's Hallowe'en Party. I'm still going to go ahead with the video, but if you don't want the solution spoiled, just click away now. I won't be offended. The movie's coming out next year, and I really have no idea what to expect. That's a lie. So, this serves as my big spoiler warning for what's ahead. Proceed at your own risk. A while back, I received a request to cover a Poirot adaptation that improved on the book. I think the desired story was Cat Among the Pigeons, but as we're in spooky season, I've decided to cover Hallowe'en Party. I guess that also means I'll have to think of a way to scare you at the end of this video. Hallowe'en Party was first published in 1969 and was the 31st novel to feature Hercule Poirot. It was adapted for the TV series Agatha Christie's Poirot by Mark Gatiss in 2010. Personally, I suspect it was a major contributor to the inspiration of the film Knives Out. You'll see why. The book begins with preparations for the titular party. One of the helpers is Poirot's friend, Ariadne Oliver, the mystery author, a character based on Agatha Christie herself. A 13-year-old girl named Joyce tells her,
I saw a murder once.
Don't be silly, Joyce.
I did? Oh, really?
Though it wasn't until recently that she realized it was a murder she saw. Everyone listening dismisses her, believing she's lying to get attention. The party goes smoothly, the apple-bobbing event being one of the most popular. However, just after the party comes a shocking discovery. Joyce has been drowned in the apple-bobbing bucket. All the locals believe the murder was committed by an unseen intruder, but Mrs. Oliver suspects it had something to do with Joyce's boast earlier. She asks Poirot to investigate. Turning to the film, although the same events occur with pretty much the same characters, there are a frack ton of changes, one of which I consider to be more significant than the rest. The early chapters of the book introduce a large number of characters, but none of them is particularly memorable. As those chapters are told from Mrs. Oliver's point of view, the other partygoers are all a blur. We're given vague impressions, but nothing we'd really remember. The film, on the other hand, focuses our attention on a select few, each with a distinct personality. Some are drawn from the book, and some are film only, with possible inspiration from the book. We have Judith Butler, Mrs. Oliver's friend, Judith's daughter Miranda, who is homesick during the party, Rowena Drake, the hostess, her adult children, double entendre intended, Francis and Edmund, Reverend Cottrell, the vicar, Miss Whittaker, the church organist, Mrs. Goodbody, the local witch and fortune-teller, Joyce, of course, her mother, Mrs. Reynolds, and her brother, Leopold. With only a few spoken lines each, we're given a solid impression of each potential suspect, and it's presented in a way that makes it interesting, rather than a laundry list.
I do beg your pardon.
No, it's my fault. I'm always in the way.
Sun's well over the yardarm, mother mine.
We have put her living in the tomb. It's awfully good.
Well, I'm more concerned with the fall of the House of Drake at the moment, so stir your stumps.
Most intriguing is how each character reacts to Joyce's boast.
What kind of murder, you ridiculous creature?
She's making it up. Again.
I'm not. Why didn't you go to the coppers then? Because I didn't know at the time that it was a murder. Of course, now I'm older, I know that it was a murder I saw.
Utterly potty.
In the book, Poirot travels to the village where the crime took place and immediately looks up his old friend, Superintendent Spence, who happens to have retired there. Operating on the theory that Joyce was telling the truth and that the killer silenced her post-haste, Spence and his sister Elspeth list all the deaths in the village that might have been the murder Joyce witnessed. These include Leslie Ferrier, a young man with criminal tendencies, Ms. White, another schoolteacher, and Mrs. Llewellyn Smythe, who happened to be Rowena Drake's aunt. Poirot begins questioning the village folk about Joyce and these deaths. Most everyone he speaks to believes Joyce fabricated the story, as she had a reputation for doing so. One thing I noticed when rereading the book was that several times the same idea, sometimes even the same sentence, is repeated again and again. One such idea is that increased homicide was a direct result of the release of mental patients due to overcrowding. My primary reasons for disliking this novel are the grueling pace and the lack of interesting characters, but this added stigma toward mental health certainly doesn't help. Many scenes taken together make up an ongoing, misinformed debate between the ideals of justice and leniency toward juvenile criminals, which thankfully is completely disregarded in the film. I did enjoy it when Mrs. Oliver compared Poirot to a computer, which I'd forgotten about and wasn't expecting in an original novel. I wonder if that's where they got the idea for the adaptation of Murder is Easy. The majority of Poirot's interviews involve him listening to people ramble on, which, let's be honest, is how his interviews go in general, only in this book it fails to be compelling. Things that catch his interest include an account of Rowena Drake looking at the library door during the party and being so startled she dropped a vase of flowers, Mrs. Llewellyn Smythe's garden and its caretaker, Michael Garfield, and the story of Olga, an au pair girl to whom Mrs. Llewellyn Smythe left all her wealth and possessions, until a forgery was discovered, and Olga fled before she could be prosecuted. No one could believe the old woman would disinherit her own family and leave everything to a foreign servant girl. Sound familiar? Poirot also interviews two young men who posit that the murder Joyce saw was her own, via psychic power. I'm almost sorry they were left out of the film. Other characters who didn't make it from page to screen are the local doctor, Joyce's sister Anne, the Spence siblings, and the school's headmistress, who functions as this story's Miss Marple equivalent. Instead of the Spences, Poirot gets his information on possible past homicides from Mrs. Goodbody. Unlike in the book, she's a village outcast, which gives her an outsider's perspective on the goings-on. He also interacts more with Inspector Raglan, who in the book is described as exceedingly kind, though here he's a bit of an ass. Come to think of it, there's an Inspector Raglan in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, who's also asinine. I wonder if it's the same guy. Let's compare first names. In Hallowe'en Party, his first name is Henry, and then it changes to Tim. Never mind. The film story hits all the main plot points, but with so many new relationships built between the characters, those plot points are surrounded by more flavorful interactions. For instance, the vicar was the one who brought Olga to this country, so he feels responsible for her attempt to defraud the Drake family. Ferrier was Mrs. Reynolds' lodger and Francis's lover, casting suspicion on them both. Mrs. Drake treats Michael Garfield with great animosity, as does Judith Butler, who is uncomfortable with him being around her daughter. Although it transpires that none of the past deaths Poirot is told about was the murder referenced by Joyce, the death of Miss White becomes a film subplot. As in the book, Miss Whittaker insists that what happened to her friend has nothing to do with the present-day violence. The book hints at a same-sex relationship, which is also retained. What's different is that in the film, she's drowned instead of strangled, and Poirot eventually infers that the death was suicide. But this all happens after another murder is committed. In the book, Poirot asks Mrs. Drake what could have startled her so badly that she dropped the vase. She swears it was a silly accident, implying she might know something, which, if not divulged, could put her in great danger. In the film, Poirot states this outright, and it does indeed look like she's going to be offed next, until they switched around and kill off Leopold instead. When this happens, Mrs. Drake confesses that she saw Leopold in the library, and that she'd thought him guilty of his sister's murder, and wanted to get him psychological help. This conversation underscores what appears to be the theme of the book, touching again on the question of justice versus mercy, with the implication that too much mercy can endanger the innocent. It could make for an interesting discussion, but, again, not if it perpetuates misconceptions about mental health. Those dealing with mental health issues are more likely to become victims of violence than perpetrators. In the film, the theme is more introspective. Multiple characters seem to thrive off real-life horror stories, to the point where they forget about the tragedy of it. Just because something happens a lot doesn't mean we should think of it as normal. Or, as Poirot puts it,
Georges, at this time of year in Belgium, it is the custom to light the candles in memory of the dead, not to tell the stories macabre.
In the book, Poirot realizes Miranda is in great danger. He takes steps to protect her, but she still ends up kidnapped. What happens next is confusing, as it seems the killer attempts to both poison and stab her. At the last moment before she becomes the third child murder victim, the two eccentric young men rescue her. Poirot had tasked them with protecting her, as a backup plan. It turns out Joyce never actually saw a murder. Miranda did. Joyce repeated Miranda's story, but substituted herself for her friend. But what murder did she witness? Well, it turns out Olga never left town after all. Mrs. Llewellyn Smythe really did leave her everything, but the murderer hired Ferrier to replace the legal document with a forgery. That's right, the murderer is the old woman's niece, Rowena Drake. She killed all those people to inherit the money. Olga, Ferrier, Joyce, Leopold, her aunt, and even her husband, it's implied. The clue to her guilt was the water she spilled on herself to cover up the water that soaked her when she drowned Joyce. But Rowena had an accomplice, Michael Garfield. The two were lovers, though it's hinted Michael would have later killed Rowena to get his hands on the money himself. He wanted to buy land in Greece to create new, beautiful gardens. One thing that made Poirot suspect Michael was that he saw Michael sketching Miranda, knowing the gardener valued beautiful things, but had no emotional attachment to anyone but himself. Poirot realized he wanted a lasting image of the girl before he murdered her. When this attempt fails, he kills himself. Later it's revealed he was actually Miranda's father. In the film, Michael is the first one exposed as a killer. In a rare display of physical confrontation, Poirot saves the girl himself. It's a shame the actress who played Miranda didn't continue her acting career. Her performance is incredible. Then Poirot reveals Rowena as Michael's accomplice, confirming that her husband's death was not accidental. Throughout the book, it was hinted that Olga might be dead, but Mark Gatiss wisely saves this reveal till the third act. In fact, I'd say this is the best piece of screenwriting Gatiss has ever done. He's taken the core plot points, simplified them, and built a new story around them while expanding on some of the more minor elements. For example, instead of just throwing it in, the revelation that Michael is Miranda's father is a deliberate ploy by Poirot in order to draw a confession from Rowena via emotional outburst. When adapting a novel, it's a screenwriter's job to find the best way to present the author's story in a new medium. Sometimes it's just not possible to do this and make the movie, well, good, especially if the novel is poorly written. In this case, Mark Gatiss has proven himself more than capable. I wonder what it'd be like if he adapted Postern of Fate. Told you I'd scare you. Happy Halloween, everyone!